Thank you for visiting Sherlock Mysteries, the place where all sorts of fascinating stories and mysteries are brought to life. If you enjoy what you see, please subscribe so you can continue on this thrilling adventure of suspense and intrigue. We would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. We value your feedback immensely. Part 1 of Revenge, a letter written long ago on a cool autumn morning in Esmery Mead. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite chair by the window, her fine lace-making hands accompanied by the lingering scent of burning logs. Outside, the hedge RS glistened with the remnants of an early frost, and smoke lazily curled into the sky from chimneys. Young Tom Price arrived with the mail just as Miss Marple was enjoying her morning tea. Through the window, the village postman nodded courteously to her as he walked past the garden gate. Putting aside her lacework, Miss Morell picked up the stack of letters that had been delivered. Most of them were the usual fare: an invitation to tea from Mrs. Bantry, a catalogue from a linen company, and a notice about an upcoming fête from the church committee. However, it was the fourth envelope that caught her eye. The handwriting was unmistakably neat and hurried, with the precision of a man who was usually meticulous, but on this particular occasion rather nervous. John A. Phelps, without hearing from Albert in years, ever since he left London to oversee the Ashgrove Hotel, a charming, albeit rather antiquated property tucked away in the countryside. Miss Marple's delicate blue brows narrowed ever so slightly as she retrieved her reading glasses. She unfurled the letter, "My dear Miss Marple," by sliding a small silver knife along the edge of the envelope. "The police have investigated, but something still doesn't add up, and I am at my wit's end after a horrible murder happened at Ashgrove. I am writing to you about this urgent problem. I remember how you had a knack for finding out the truth, and I implore you to come right away if at all possible." After giving the letter a thorough reading, Miss Merrill's normally icy expression betrayed a hint of worry. The setting a hotel was hardly out of the ordinary. After all, hotels were places where strangers could come and go, conceal their identities, and bury their secrets. However, Albert's tone and the sense of urgency hinted that this was no ordinary crime. She set the letter down and reached for her tea, which had cooled her mind. Her mind was already racing with questions about the nature of the murder. Why was he still worried, given that the police had investigated? Was it a case of passion, a botched robbery, or something more calculated? The vicar's wife, Mrs. Caroline Lucas, was bustling about when a sharp knock at the door cut through her train of thought. With a gentle call, the door swung open, and Mrs. Lucas entered. "Rosie, I hope I'm not waking you awake, but Miss Harnow just told me something terrifying." She froze when she saw the letter on the table. "Jane, you seem quite worried. Is something wrong?" Marple, Miss, wore a subtle smile. "A fairly disturbing letter from an old acquaintance, James Phelps, manager of the Ashgrove Hotel, was received by Caroline, who was not easily discouraged. Mrs. Margaret, however, took a seat and leaned forward in response to the letter. "Oh, Ashgrove, that is a beautiful establishment, isn't it? I heard it hasn't been able to keep up with modern hotels. Something about renovations being necessary," so Miss Margaret agreed, her fingers lightly resting on the letter. However, business worries aren't Albert's only concern. A murder has occurred. Rather than speaking to her friend, Mrs. Margaret spoke to herself, "and Albert wants me to come." "Jane, that's terrible. You mean you're going to ... Mrs. Luke gazed at her. "Caroline, it's hard to say no to a plea for assistance, particularly when it involves a murder investigation. and Miss Marple's grin was the kind that often lead others to misjudge her. "Jane, I think the cops can handle this, even though Mrs. Margaret seemed faintly horrified. Then, in keeping with her characteristic practicality, Mrs. Margaret straightened her coat and said, "Well, if you insist on rushing off to investigate murders, I shall insist that you take your woolen scarf. Otherwise, you will meet your demise." This was followed by a pleasant agreement from Miss Marple, but she warned that, in her experience, murders are rarely as they seem. As the train chugged along, Miss Marple settled into her seat and allowed herself the briefest of smiles. She had long ago learned that murders were very much like knitting patterns full of knots, so she packed lightly with just the essentials, including her knitting, which helped her appear inconspicuous while observing others. Within the hour, she was bidding farewell to St. Mary and stepping onto the small train that would take her towards Ashgrove, a mystery that was still shrouded in uncertainty but was preoccupying her thoughts. There were tangles and complicated patterns, and the solution was somewhere in the stitches. All she had to do was uncover it. Second chapter, a disturbing finding. The train ride to Ashgrove had been peaceful, and Miss Marple had occupied herself, looking out the window, her mind formulating scenarios that had been a habit of hers for years. After all, murder, like knitting, was all about patterns. As she reached Ashgrove station, dusk was falling over the countryside. As she anxiously paced nervously from foot to foot, she was greeted by a gentle mist that encircled the hedge, filling the air with the aroma of damp leaves and distant wood smoke. The normally collected hotel manager now looked visibly shaken, his fingers twitching as he spoke with James Phelps, a slender man with a receding hairline and an apprehensive demeanor. As he fine-tuned his eyewear extending a hand, he breathlessly remarked, "Miss Marple, your arrival has relieved me in ways words can describe." Mildly, Miss Marple grasped his hand. "Dear Albert, you are exhausted. Come on, let's not waste time standing in the cold. Instead, tell me everything while we make our way to the Ashgrove Hotel, which was once a magnificent country estate." A sense of worn-out grandeur pervaded retreat. Ivy was climbing too high up the stone walls, and there was a missing shutter on the otherwise dignified facade. Miss Marple felt uneasy as she stepped inside, despite the pleasant glow from the windows. As they hurried up the stairs, Phelps whispered, "The police have come and gone, and they seemed satisfied that it was an outsider robbery. Maybe, but I swallowed hard." They passed the heavy oak reception desk, where Mrs. Graves, the senior housekeeper, nodded strangely in acknowledgement. Yesterday evening, it had occurred. There must be more to this than just a burglary gone bad, in my opinion. Assuringly, Miss Marple rubbed his arm and said, "Let's see what there is to see." After a long, dimly lighted corridor, they reached room 14. A uniformed constable waited outside, his expression glum, and nodded as they stepped inside. It was usually best, Miss Marple had discovered, to take in the big picture before getting too caught up in the finer points. So she stopped just inside the doorway to let her keen eyes take it all in. Impressively, the room was absolutely clean. A man, a woman, and their bodies lay in an oddly symmetrical arrangement. Their faces were expressionless in an unnatural stillness. A pool of dark, dried blood had accumulated beneath them, and their throats were still crucified. Miss Marple's perceptive eyes noted the absence of any indication of conflict, including toppled chairs and shattered glass. They apparently trusted the killer or failed to see it coming. She died swiftly and showed no evidence of panic or defensive wounds. As she surveyed the room, her gaze fell upon a little circular table in the middle. 4 glasses rested upon it, 3 of which were devoid of any liquid. The 4th, however, held a golden liquid that appeared to be brandy, possibly tainted with poison, as Phelps gestured toward it. Our missing friend may have known what was in the drink, since Miss Marple's pursed lips made it appear as though 3 of us drank while the 4th refrained. She cautiously made her way around the table, being careful not to tread on any of the dead. Phelps paled. "You mean the poison wasn't the genuine means of murder?" She asked Alice if the poison was meant to kill, why slit their throats as well? There was a personal touch to the cutting of their throats that followed, possibly as a message, but Miss Marple shook her head and said it was more likely that they were poisoned first. Phelps took a deep breath, and Miss Marple advanced, her eyes darting across the room, the floor, the bed, the fireplace, and, finally, near the man's chair. In her gloved hands, she saw a folded note, which she gingerly pointed to. With great care, she took it up, unfolded it, and read the tiny, deliberate writing. "Come to me, and I will assist you." Miss Marple's lips curled into a tight line as she whispered, "But who sent it, and why?" After a moment of reflection, Miss Marple returned her attention to the corpses. The victims had probably known and trusted them enough to sit and drink. From there, 4 glasses at the gathering, but something had changed. Was it revenge? She went to the window and looked outside at the tranquil countryside. But the events that had taken place inside had been anything but peaceful. Turning back, she met Phelps's worried gaze. "No one should leave the hotel just yet, Albert. Our 4th guest might try to leave before we ask the correct questions, so we need to keep them here." A picture was starting to take shape in Miss Marple's mind, one that wasn't quite clear but was beginning to reveal patterns. She knew that murder was rarely random, and she was determined to find the 4th person who was still hiding somewhere in this hotel. So she turned her attention back to the meticulously arranged bodies, the glasses on the table, and the note placed just so. Phelps nodded rapidly, and she would make the necessary arrangements right away. Section 3. The visitors and their clandestine, as was her custom. Miss Marple rose early and sat in the cozy sitting area by the window, knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she thought about the case details. The morning light streamed through the lace curtains of her room at the Ashgrove Hotel, creating delicate patterns on the floor. T3 dead at exactly 8:30 in the morning. Miss Marple made her way downstairs to breakfast. The dining room had once been a magnificent affair, but its floral wallpaper had faded in spots, and the plush carpet bore the slight mustiness of age. A number of guests were already seated, engaged in the kind of quiet whispers that followed. A murder, a few glanced her way, clearly curious, but Miss Marple maintained a courteous, neutral expression. She then made her way to the reception desk, where Albert was waiting. "I wonder," she whispered, "if I might trouble you for the complete list of guests staying at the hotel." With an even more dire expression than the previous night, Phelps nodded and, naturally, withdrew a ledger from beneath the music counter. "The police have already recorded the names, Miss Marple, but if you think they could be useful, please let them know." Miss Marple smiled warmly at him. "In my experience, the most reliable indicator is human nature. A name, a detail even, the tiniest thing might reveal a tremendous mystery." Albert with interest. She grasped the list and flipped over its items. Nearly all of the names were carefully typed by Phelps, but 3 in particular caught my eye. Mr. Harold Carrere, an entrepreneur, Miss Evelyn Harrow, his fiancée, the Hun, Margaret Reed, on the night of the murder. Evelyn's companion gathered with Mr. Carstairs, who had paid for their entire stay. She glanced up and inquired, "Does Mr. Carstairs come here often?" From what I gather, Phelps arrived 3 nights ago, accompanied by the 2 women, and at first glance, everything appeared to be going swimmingly. Then he hesitated, and, well, that was quite typical, too. He confessed that Miss Marple's eyes were constantly agog. They appear anxious, particularly Mr. Carstairs, you might whisper. Her next stop was at the home of the victim's maid, a young woman named Alice Dobson. Alice seemed a little anxious, her hands clenched at the hem of her apron as Miss Marple probed her. I don't know much, Alice stammered, but she did recall the victims from last night's dinner. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, and Alice scowled in concentration. What do you recall, dear? She asked. They were talking very seriously, almost arguing, but not loud, if you get my drift. Mr. Carstairs, an elderly gentleman, appeared, to be anticipating someone as he repeatedly glanced over his shoulder. Was he still holding Miss Marple's knitting needles as they rested in her lap? Miss Alice nervously chewed her lip a little while later. A man or woman did show there, and they took a seat at their table, much to Miss Marple's fascination. A lady hesitated before Alice. I noticed that I didn't get a good look at her. I caught a glimpse of her while I was clearing a table nearby. She was wearing a dark coat and a hat with a veil, the kind that women wear at funerals. Miss Marple's fingers would twitch the veil, which is a deliberate effort to hide one's face. When I asked how long she stayed, Alice said she left before the others. I remember Mr. Carstairs looking even more worried after she left. The 3 of them left the dining room together shortly after. Miss Marple smiled kindly. You had been really helpful. Alice, as she walked back through the corridor, her thoughts churned a 4th guest, a woman disguised hidden someone who had come purposefully and departed. Just as swiftly was she the missing 4th person from the murder scene, or was she only another clue in a tangled web of secrets when it came down to it? Miss Marple had always thought that murder was never really random, and she was sure that this one was no different. 4th chapter. A tragic factory with her knitting needles resting in her lap. Miss Marple took her seat on the early train to Leicester. However, she had little interest in knitting that day because her thoughts were consumed by the horrific past that appeared to bind the victims together. A seemingly insignificant question had brought her to this point: what linked Harold C's, Evelyn Harrow and Margaret Reed's past associations with the Cares Industrial Works, a now defunct factory on the outskirts of Leicester, as well as her reputation for quiet tenacity, were uncovered through some discreet inquiries conducted in the hotel. The 3 were not only friends, but also former business partners. It was determined that Miss Marple would visit the town of the source. Leicester was once a hub of industry. The skyline was adorned with smokestacks, though many of them had long since stopped producing anything. The taxi ride to the abandoned factory was brief, but what a lonely sight it was when Miss Marple stepped out onto the uneven cobblestone path. The brick walls had become blackened with age, and the windows had shattered in some spots, exposing the empty rooms within. A rusted sign clung to the entrance gate. With a shiver, she pictured the deserted site of Carstairs Industrial Works, which had been open from 1897 until its closure in 1933. The place had once been a hive of activity, with the sound of machinery and the aroma of oil and iron filling the air. But now there was complete quiet. Nearby, a small public house stood with its door ajar. She assumed that was a meeting spot where employees used to go to talk about pay, drink beer while venting about their bosses and swapping anecdotes. In the dimly lit room, Miss Marple's keen blue eyes swept the room as the scent of damp wood and stale beer lingered in the air. An elderly barman glanced up from wiping down the counter and glanced pleasantly at Miss Marple. "Good morning," she said. "May I trouble you for some information?" The barman raised a bushy brow, his expression depending on the type of information she was asking. Rather than Miss Marple's smile was deceiving. She seemed interested in the abandoned factory down the road. But the man's face turned gloomy as he started to open up about what had happened almost a decade ago. A leak of deadly gas had leaked from one of the storage units, going unnoticed until it was too late, killing 16 men and women, even the youngest with her hands folded in her lap. She listened silently as the man rattled off the names of the fathers, husbands, and spouses who had perished in a horrific tragedy because they were unlucky. The barman snorted, and Miss Marple whispered something about an accident. The court had decided so, but we all knew better. Their lips were pursed into a narrow line as they sliced, a sign that they understood the machinery was malfunctioning. She leaned forward ever so slightly. Corners disregarded the warnings and emerged unscathed when disaster struck. Not a single one of them displayed arrogance. Harrow or Reed was incarcerated for 1 day, rather than the individuals here were, as Miss Marple's grip on her purse grew tighter. The man persisted in his fury, but nothing could be done. The Lord didn't care about the factory workers. Those 3 were allowed to return to their luxurious homes as the rest of us laid our dead to rest. Mrs. Marple let out a long breath. Miss Marple returned to the Ashgrove Hotel after a peaceful journey in Chapter 5, a doctor with a history, though she was technically resting her head on the carriage glass. The tale she had discovered in the deserted factory continued to preoccupy her. Outside, the countryside rolled by. There were 16 lives lost in an unsolved tragedy, and the 3 factory owners were murdered in a very calculated manner. If it had been revenge, as she had a strong suspicion it had been, then the question remained of who had carried it out. However, her train of thinking was abruptly stopped as we drew near the hotel. We could feel the cool air and see the first hints of nightfall as the mist twisted around the trees. Miss Marple descended the stairs and entered the house, stopping only to speak politely with the vigilant housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, as she made her way to the upper corridor. Her attention was drawn to a woman emerging from the room adjacent to the crime scene. The woman was dressed in a dark green suit, with her hair neatly pulled back under a small hat. What really caught Miss Marple's attention, though, was the way the woman turned to speak to someone inside the room. "I've prescribed you some medicine," she said in a calm and measured voice. "Take it, and you'll feel better." Then, with an air of quiet efficiency, she locked the door behind her and strode rapidly down the hall with a little frown on her forehead. Miss Marple looked for the young maid she had spoken with earlier, Alice Dobson. The girl possessed an exceptional eye for detail, which was crucial to the success of the inquiry. The woman who just left room 12, whose name is she, my dear Miss Marple, stated it politely. With a hushed voice, Alice said, "That's Dr. Alice Morton. She comes here annually at the same time and in the same room." She then peeked down the corridor. Eyebrows raised by Miss Marple for what seems like an eternity, rose annually. I believe Alice clapped her hands. "She's quiet most of the time, reads a lot, and is always wonderful to the staff when they're sick." Miss Marple nodded in agreement, and Alice hesitated. "But I suppose it's because Dr. Morton's annual visits are the same week every year." Miss Marple patted the girl's arm and said, "You've been most helpful." Alice turned away, lost in thought. Miss Marple's belief in patterns led her to suspect her, even if her connection to room 12 was insufficient. Miss Marple sat down to her. Customary tea in the lounge, needles in hand, but her mind was elsewhere that evening as the horror of the killings lingered in the air. Guests nervously glanced over their shoulders, as if afraid the perpetrator may still be among them. As soon as the chance presented itself, she stealthily made her way to the upper corridor. Room 12 was locked, but Miss Marple had a reputation for being patient, which had served her well throughout the years. Instead, she decided to take a simpler route, finding a waste bin outside the door. As Miss Marple painstakingly sorted through discarded papers and tissues, she came across something small and icy, a glass bottle. In the low light, she turned it over and read the label. It was a medical vial with a hint of white powder at the base. The contents were poison. It was just a coincidence, she thought, as Miss Marple's lips tightened into a razor's edge in Chapter 6. As Miss Marple cautiously made her way to her room that evening, the stately staircase groaned softly beneath her. A storm was building, not in the skies, but in the halls of the formerly pleasant Ashgrove Hotel. She had her suspicions, which she now needed confirmed within these very walls. Not only was Dr. Alice Morton an unusual visitor, she came here annually, but she also had a room next to the crime scene, where she had thrown away what looked like a vial of poison. Most disturbing of all, she seemed unconcerned about the murders, when most people would have shown interest, distress, or at least polite concern. At exactly 9:30 a.m., Miss Marple would do what had always worked so well for her in the past. She would pretend to be a fragile old woman in need of medical attention. It was risky, but she had never been one to shy away from a necessary risk. She sat at the small desk in her room, staring at the modest tea service that the staff had left for her. The teapot had long since gone cold, but she barely noticed. Her plan was to draw out Dr. Morton, test her reactions, and carefully observe her every move. The young maid, Alice Dobson, arrived at the door moments after Miss Marple rang the little brass bell near her bed. With a sigh and a gentle touch to her forehead, Miss Marple spoke with some hesitation. The worried expression on the girl's face made me wonder if I should call the manager. Alice, I'm afraid I'm not feeling well. A subtle headshake from Miss Marple indicated, no, that won't work at all. I think I need a doctor. Fortunately, there happens to be one staying at the hotel. Dr. Morton's patient Alice hesitated. A weak smile was supplied by Miss Morell. Miss Morell rested back against the pillows and waited for a few minutes. After that, she heard quiet but deliberate footsteps outside the door, and then it swung open. The maid nodded in agreement and hurriedly left. A well-dressed woman with a little medical bag accompanied Dr. Morton into the room. When she glances over with your rapid deficit and lack of warmth, Miss Marple, you summoned me. Madame Marple is Miss Marple's side, she said softly. Excuse me, doctor, I hate to be a nuisance, but I'm feeling a little queasy. I wonder if I have a slight fever. Dr. Morton hurried over to the side of the bed and pressed his cool fingers against Miss Marple's wrist. Your pulse is steady, she said matter-of-factly. She checked her temperature, scowling slightly. Maybe it was just a mild fever, nothing to worry about. She reached into her bag and grabbed a small bottle. With an air of innocent interest, Miss Marple remarked, Doctor, what do you make of the murders? As she observed her intently, the doctor prescribed a light medication, and if Miss Marple took it before bed, she would be perfectly fine by morning. Tragically, Dr. Morton hardly paused before saying, the police will figure it out. A little clenching of Miss Marple's fingers on the bed linen occurred. A odd answer. A doctor, someone educated to save lives, ought to have voiced some deeper reaction, concern, grief, horror, and yet there was none, as if she were already aware of all that had transpired. Dr. Morton had not inquired about any specifics, and had displayed zero signs of interest. Yes, it is a horrible business. Miss Marple nodded weakly, her voice quivering slightly. Silently, Dr. Morton set the prescription bottle on the nightstand, saying, "You should rest. If you feel worse, call me." Then she packed all of her belongings and departed. Reacting in anything other than the manner befitting an innocent woman, Miss Marple sat up slowly as the sound of footfall receded down the passage. Fallen silent, despite her long-standing belief that certain mysteries necessitated deviating from the rules, Miss Marple proceeded with her next move. Just before midnight, Miss Marple took a stealthy approach through the dimly lit corridor. Dr. Morton's door was locked, as anticipated, but she had already planned ahead. She entered room 12 through the adjoining maid's quarters and searched the drawers with precision and gentle hands. The drawers held medical journals, a few neatly folded clothes, and small bottles of various pills and tonics. Her world turned upside down when she uncovered the diary, a simple black notebook tucked away under a neat stack of folded papers. Dr. Alice Morton was a Leicester native whose family had settled in a little village close to Care's industrial works. The factory accident had claimed the lives of 2 members of her family, brother and a husband, and Miss Marple's breath caught slightly as she flipped the pages and read the meticulously written words. The doctor had every motive to exact revenge on Harold Carew, Evelyn Harrow, and Margaret Reed. Nevertheless, was Miss Marple really the killer, or was there another angle to the story? Her hands quivered slightly as she closed the diary. Miss Marple meticulously reinserted the die seeker. She had learned a lot that night, but whether Dr. Morton had been the executioner or just the mastermind remained a mystery. One thing was certain, though. She was not working alone, and Miss Marple planned to uncover the identity of the last missing piece of the puzzle in Chapter 7. The morning's handwriting match had not yet been lifted. Upon her descent from the majestic Ashgrove hotel staircase, Miss Marple's expression was one of calm determination. The events of the previous evening had left her with much to think about, but now it was time to find proof. Doctor was no longer merely an interested party. She was a woman with a past that linked her directly to the tragedy at Carstairs Industrial Works. Miss Marple's intention was to prove that she had orchestrated this lethal act of revenge. The door to room 14, the site of the murders, remained locked, but Albert, the worried manager, was happy to supply a key when Miss Marple explained that she had one final item to examine. "I don't see how any more clues can be found," Albert offered. Albert stutters as he follows Miss Marple down the hall. Yet, such is life. Entering the musty, lifeless room, Miss Marple allowed her piercing sight to sweep over the gruesome crime. Seen, as she said, it is the smallest, most overlooked detail that reveals everything. The glasses on their sides, the carpet marked by hard, hardened stains, the chair where Harold Carew had sat before, oblivious to his own demise, and, finally, a single folded note, its edges slightly twisted with your mysterious object, possibly. A trap was discovered near Care's chair, and Miss Marple handled it with great care as she unfolded it with precision. "If you need assistance, you can visit my hotel." While taking another item out of her purse, Miss Marple's demeanour remained unchanged. "Dr. Morton's journal, Albert," in a gentle tone, Miss Marple asked, "Would you be willing to help me?" She presented him with the diary, which she had opened to. a page where Dr. Morton had written in her precise, steady script. Next, she put down the note from the crime site beside it. The hotel manager, who appeared somewhat uncertain about the entire affair, adjusted his spectacles. Chapter 8. The Last Showdown. Phelps scowled as his pupils dilated. As the sun rose above the Ashgrove Hotel, a haunting melody of muted tones of gold and grey filled the air. The opulent building, known for its stately front and opulent past, now bore the burden of a horrific murder. After days of meticulous preparation, Miss Marple finally rang the bell for Albert, who arrived at her door within minutes. Albert's thin face betrayed his anxiety, and she spoke softly. "I think it's time we gathered everyone in the lounge. If you would be so kind, the police could be involved, too." Albert's brow furrowed. She meant that he knew who had done it. There was an air of tension in the hotel lounge, which had once been a place for peaceful leisure, as the other guests sat in restrained silence, inquisitive and apprehensive, waiting for Inspector Graves. Miss Marple smiled weakly and said, "Yes, my dear Albert, I believe I do." "Well, Miss Marple," a burly man with piercing eyes said, his voice tinged with suspicion, as he stood near the fireplace, arms crossed. A hush descended upon the room as Miss Marple nodded and turned to Dr. Alice Morton, who sat serenely with her hands folded in her lap. With a gentle but firm tone, she said, "You are the murderer." The doctor showed no emotion, instead raising an eyebrow and raising an unreadable expression, saying, "That's absurd." The note discovered by Mr. Carr's chair, the same message that had enticed him and his companions, was written in your hand. Miss Marple held up, and she shook her head, saying, "No, my dear, it is the truth." Her voice remained gentle but unwavering. The diary, when opened to a page containing careful, methodical handwriting, closely matches the thin line that Dr. Morton's lips formed while he wrote. As Miss Marple said, "You brought them here, didn't you? You offered them the false promise that you might assist them, maybe even provide a solution to their financial problems. But when they arrived, you poisoned them." A murmur resounded around the room, and Albert paled at the maid. Inspector Graves stiffened as Alice gulped for air, while Miss Marple watched Dr. Morton's reaction. The doctor's expression stayed expressionless, and her grip on her lap tightened ever so slightly. Miss Marple let out a small sigh, as if to say, "Of course, poison alone was not enough. You wanted their deaths to mirror the pain of those lost in the gas leak." Dr. Morton paused, her expression changing subtly. A flicker of pain appeared in her eyes, and the room fell into a long silence. Finally, Dr. Morton exhaled slowly, acknowledging the weight of the single word. She raised her eyes to Miss Marple, and for the first time, her normally composed demeanor cracked, exposing a lot more vulnerability. "I lost everything that day," she said, her voice steady but hollow, "because they knew about the faulty tools that they sliced despite the warnings. Corners went to the others, and 16 innocent people, including my brother and husband, died as a result." Her expression was one of intense frustration as she shook her head in disapproval at the court's decision to let the guilty go free and go about their lives as if nothing had transpired. "You chose to take matters into your own hands after Miss Marple's disappointment with the legal system led you to look at her with a mixture of sympathy and sorrow." There was an air of mystery as Dr. Morton's lips curled into an expression that was neither smiling nor frowning. Inspector Graves entered the room, and it seemed as though Dr. Morton himself was making an appearance. His tone remained stern, but murder remains murder. As the doctor's attention redirected to Miss Marple, I was about to confess that I had intended to turn myself in after the fact. However, I waited because I was curious to see how you would handle the situation. Her eyes exhibited an air of almost admiration. Softly, Miss Martell sighed. Revenge, my darling, is a terrible thing. It never ends well and only causes more suffering. Inspector, I guess you're correct. Dr. Morton finally nodded after a lengthy period of silence. Before escorting her away, Graves motioned for the waiting constables to arrest her. Dr. Morton retreated for a last time to inform me that she had mentioned keeping her voice down at some point. Miss Marple's subtle smirk betrayed her lack of interest in the matter, which, my dear, was completely out of character. The visitors began to leave, whispering amongst themselves, and Dr. Morton emitted a quiet, almost nostalgic laugh before being escorted out of the room. Albert, who was visibly upset, remained silent. Looking out the big bay window, Miss Marple could see the eternally undulating countryside. Justice, in her mind, was a funny thing. Sometimes it came quickly, other times it came years too late. Regardless, with a quiet sigh, Miss Marple returned to the fire and knitted another case closed, another mystery unravelled. But she knew there would be another epilogue, the last thread. As the afternoon sun dipped below the Ashgrove Hotel's lace curtains, it had been a day of quiet departure. The police officers had come and gone, their presence no longer needed now. That Dr. Alice Morton was in custody. The guests, relieved but still shaken, had started checking out their whispers of scandal, and tragedy was slowly fading as they departed. A faint click of knitting needles could be heard as Miss Marple sat in her beloved chair, close to the fireplace. Albert, the hotel manager, appeared pale and had been stirring his tea absent-mindedly for a while. Now, his spoon was making small, aimless circles in the cup. At last, he murmured, and Miss Marple looked up at him with a thoughtful expression on her face. Murderers rarely do, Albert. People imagine them as wild-eyed villains. More often than not, they are very much like the rest of us. Ordinary, quiet, clever even, she said, but always driven by something. Albert revealed that this something was get even nodding. Miss Marple sighed as she looked out the window at the gardens, where a gentle mist had started to creep in. It is a terrible thing that revenge does not restore what has been lost. The individuals she killed had indeed escaped the courts, but not her justice. After a little pause, Albert nodded slowly. There's something I still don't quite understand. Oh, my beloved Albert leaned forward and asked, Miss Marple, why did you hesitate? Why didn't she just disappear after the crime? Why did she stay and watch you solve it? Miss Marple smiled slightly. The steady rhythm of Miss App's knitting needles resumed after a brief pause. Albert looked at her with knowing eyes and said, Some murderers do not fear the consequences of their actions. Dr. Morton had already accepted that this was the end for her, but she still wanted to be understood by Miss Marple. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Albert shook his head, seemingly relieved, as he thought about how much they owe each other. Miss Marple had played a pivotal role in stopping the killer. With a warm smile, Miss Marple, the truth, as always, was plain to see. All it needed was a little untangling. She raised her knitting needles to show Albert the spot where a neat row of stitches had formed a perfect pattern H. It looked like a stray thread that needed to be delicately pulled back into place. Albert let out a faint laugh. You really hit the mark this time around with your thread selection. A train whistle sounded, heralding the start of yet another journey, and Miss Marple could only grin as she stood outside the Grand Hotel, where the mist had gathered like a ghostly spectre of long-forgotten secrets. Miss Marple would always be prepared for the next mystery as she gathered her knitting and purse.